life is not a game. When life is over, you don't celebrate that you won. You're just dead, right?
Is life worth living?
That's a surprisingly easy question to answer, right? Because it kind of has to be subjective, right? It has to be unique to the individual.
What is philosophy?
People get hung up on it a lot, It's structured, critical thinking about pretty much anything.
How do you define what is good exactly?
Then the question is, well, how does evil exist without being created? I don't think that God could create evil if he's all good. So where did evil come from?
It sounds to me like good by itself cannot exist, because something cannot be good if the opposite is not possible.
If we put ourselves into God's shoes, wouldn't it be better not to create that than to create it and send millions of people to hell?
I want to push back there. That voice will tell you to feel guilty or to apologize or to do something about it in order to set things right. And then the question is, why is that voice there? And what is that voice? Philosophy seems to be one of the things that everybody talks about, but nobody really knows what philosophy actually is, right? If you break it down to its core components, what are we talking about?
Right.
And what does it mean? How can you take different elements of different philosophies, different ideas, different people that lived in the past that brought forward their ideas, and how can you not just learn from those, but how can you apply those in your daily lives? So before we go down that rabbit hole, because I'm very sure that we have more than enough to go through, why don't you give a quick introduction of who you are and what you do, and then let's start with the question, okay, what is philosophy?
Yeah, so I'm Joel Bouchard, and it's always difficult to answer the question what I do. And I actually answered this question on another podcast recently. And I said, it sort of depends on when you catch me, like what my mood is a little bit, because I'm somebody who, I don't really like labels or categorizing things. I've got a book that will be coming out here in the next couple weeks, a little treatise on, well, it's actually the title is a treatise on challenges from nature to anthropocentric ontology. So it's talking about how, if we look closely at nature and specifically other creatures, we can kind of see a bit of a challenge to our notion of what it means to be, right? What it means to exist in reality, that we kind of overlook because we put humans at the center of the universe to some regard. And I start out that book by saying that, just what I said to you earlier, that everything's philosophical and everybody's a philosopher. And I say, but I don't think of myself as a philosopher. So I'm going to blow to my own credibility, right, as a contradiction, because I don't like categorizing. I don't like labels. I do a lot of music, but I don't think of myself as a musician. I don't like, I think of myself as just sort of being in the moment, and there's a lot of things that I do. And so, yeah, I work a normal job, and I do astrophotography, and I do a philosophy podcast, and I do music, and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, I don't like really defining myself by any of them, so it's a funny question. But so philosophy, that being one where, like you said, people get hung up on it a lot, and I think that part of it is throughout history, philosophy's had like the worst marketing, like when I took my first philosophy class in community college, I didn't really know what it was, all right, it's something about dusty books and guys with big beards who are angry at the world. And I don't know, it's kind of boring, but I need a class. And I took it, and it was so much more alive and vibrant than that. And I realized that philosophy is something that really we're doing all the time, and so that's what makes it difficult. And it's one of the sort of contradictions that exists in philosophy that makes it so difficult to understand. Because it's the origins of the arts, all the art that we do. It's the origin of all the science that we do. And then in addition to being the origin, it's also the cutting edge, right? All of science stems from natural philosophy. And then at the cutting edge, all science devolves back into philosophy, into this sort of speculative hypothesizing about what could be. So as a result, it's it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, and it makes it difficult to define. But it's structured, critical thinking about pretty much anything, and so it separates it from just being somebody's opinion. You can't just say, "Yeah, I think the sky's red." That's just a fallacious opinion, but you have to come up with a structured reason for why it is that you think the way something is. So it's heavily logic based. And there's different types. There's logical analytical philosophy, but there's also philosophy that's built in other ways, which adds to the complexity of the construct and some of the other difficulties in understanding it. But at its core, right, it's really just looking at something very hard and coming up with a critical answer for why it is the way it is. And that's something that I really do believe everybody does, at least with something, right? You could find the most boring person on earth or the most anti-intellectual person on earth. You could find whoever. And I think that there's always going to be that one thing that if you can find it and ask them about it, they'll be able to give you a great depth of detail and a highly structured argument for the nuances of the thing that they're obsessed with. So I think that's kind of the breakdown in general terms that I'd give it.
You believe that everybody is operating on a philosophy, whether they consider themselves philosophical or not. So before things like reasoning happens, before things like making decisions happen, you believe that every single human on the planet, they operate on a philosophy that they have defined for themselves or that they have maybe been given or received in their lives. Do I have that correctly?
Yeah, I think so. And so I think that we all have an implicit philosophy, which is what you're referring to there, right? A way that we live our lives. So the way that we metaphysically understand reality. So there's, the metaphysics of what we believe reality to be, the epistemic knowledge of what we know about it, the ontological engagement with how we exist in light of that knowledge and in light of that reality, and then sort of our aesthetic preferences and our logical way of putting all the pieces together. So I think that's like the implicit part that we all have. And then I think there's also explicit philosophies, which are more narrow, things that we look at specifically, and then we apply more of a cognitive process, a logical, analytical process to it to understand those things better. So kind of a twofold path there.
As an example, implicit will be something like feeling or deciding what will be a good action or a bad action. And something explicit would be something like defining the ontology or defining utilitarianism or something along those lines. So making an actual idea very practical and laying it out in some kind of framework.
Or what a pet is, that type of thing. So, yeah, so implicit, and that's why, a question that I get a lot and I always enjoy is people go, "Oh, you're a philosopher, right? Like, so what's the meaning of life?" And that's a surprisingly easy question to answer, right? Because it kind of has to be subjective, right? It has to be unique to the individual because we all operate on different implicit ontology or implicit philosophies, right? So if, let's say you're highly religious, your metaphysical understanding of the universe is that there's a deity and there's an afterlife, and your epistemic knowledge is that there's rules that you need to abide by in order to access the afterlife, and your ontological engagement with reality based off of your metaphysical and epistemological understanding will lead you to act a certain way and have certain aesthetic preferences that are completely different from somebody who is an atheist or whatever the case may be. And that's where meaning comes from, right? Meaning is the integration of all of those pieces. So what is the meaning of life? There's not a singular meaning of life for every human on the planet. It's something that's individualized, it's individuated to an extent. So, and that's unsatisfying for some people, because I think that they want to see an overarching meaning. But it's just not something that really you can, if you look at it from multiple different angles, you can just cut little pieces off here and there until there's nothing left really. And so it's hard to give this overarching answer.
Yeah, and let's try to break it down. I'm actually quite curious how you would approach this, because if you ask yourself the question, not necessarily what is the meaning of life, but let's ask ourselves the question: is life worth living? Right. That also has a relation to the word meaning, right? Because if there is no meaning, you could make the argument, I think, that that the answer to that question is no, life is not worth living because there is no point, there is no meaning. And I think that's also where you enter the realm of nihilism, at least in a relational sense. So if, and tell me what you think about this, but if you ask yourself the question, is life worth living? That means you have to find meaning first. And then the question becomes, okay, where do you find that? And an answer might be, well, if you are religious or you believe in a deity, like you said, in God, for example, you might believe in the idea that serving that God, which means serving that which is highest, which means serving everything around you, which is your community, your the animals around you, yourself, nature, environment, all of those different things, then that would become a implicit meaning that you could live towards, and that will make the answer to the question, is life worth living? Yes. But the moment that you approach that from a agnostic perspective, the perspective of there is no God, can you then, what would your approach to that question be if religion is not in the equation? Can the answer to the question, is life worth living, then still be yes?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. It becomes more difficult to answer, which I don't think is a bad thing. As a matter of fact, as somebody who's drawn to philosophy, my favorite questions are the ones that are hard to answer. My favorite questions are the ones that you can't answer, like, because I'm a bit of a masochist like that, right? I like to think about these things forever, knowing that I'm never going to get anywhere, because to me, that is what makes life a bit meaningful to me, is just this reality that is stranger than any fiction you could possibly write. The idea that we're so small and so limited in our understanding that we will never be able to completely comprehend what's out there and what there is. That's scary to a lot of people, and I can understand why. It's scary to me, right? But it's also, I think that at least in English, we have a limitation of terms on that feeling, right? Because scary only defines the negative aspects of the feeling. But really, there's a sublime aspect, right? There's this, again, we use the word terrifying or terrible, but it's something that is just, it's overwhelming, but in a good way, in some regards. But there's a term that you use that I think sort of cues us in a little bit, right? So, we covered how somebody with a religious paradigm, they kind of have the answers, and so this question of meaning isn't really hard for them to establish. In some ways, they have a cheat sheet, right? They have a guidebook. Okay, here's my religious text. This gives me the answers. I followed the prescription. I've lived a good life. Now, if you're atheistic, that becomes more difficult. And as a matter of fact, I don't like the atheistic position because I think that you close off too many possibilities, right? If you're saying, because the difference between atheistic and agnostic, right? Agnostic is just saying, I don't know. Atheistic is saying there is no God. And I think that that's a really arrogant position for a human to take, right? To say, I know there's no God. Well, how could you? How could you know that there's no God? None of us could possibly know that, right? Because if you conceptualize God as this all-powerful being, there's nothing to say that he couldn't, I don't want to say hide himself from us, right? But I mean, he could. He could, just because he's all-powerful doesn't mean that he's all good, regardless of what our religious texts might say. deism, which was popular in the 1700s, was this idea that of the watchmaker God is what they called it, where God built the universe, everything you see, but then he just kind of got bored and went and built a different universe somewhere else, or we don't know what he did, but he left. And the reason that they came up with that idea was because they didn't see any intervention from God in the natural world, right? Everything seems to go by natural law. And so, like a watch, right? The way that a watch ticks, right? Somebody wound up the watch at the beginning of time, they set it in motion, and then they left. That's possible, right? The Christian God could be possible. The Muslim God could be possible. The millions of Hindu gods could be possible. The flying spaghetti monster could be possible. I can't prove it wrong, right? Because all of that stuff is outside of scientific empirical endeavor. So if you can construct a logic, no matter how silly or odd it might be, if it's outside of the realm to be empirically studied, I can't prove it wrong. So it's sort of arrogant of me to say, nah, it doesn't exist. So I believe that everybody on the planet, right, is necessarily agnostic, right? We don't know anything, but we're all searching. And to me, it's the searching that gives it meaning. And that's where the paradigm shifts, right? This idea of meaning is religious people, their meaning doesn't actually come from the knowledge they have of their religion, but it's that search for the knowledge in the religion, right? It's that process, because life is not a game. In a game, you play till the buzzer, and then at the end, you celebrate because you won, right? Well, when life is over, you don't celebrate that you won. You're just dead, right? So you have to, the whole thing's a journey throughout. And so I think that, religious people, they're looking for meaning in religion throughout their lives, and that establishes it for them. If you're an agnostic person, right, you can find meaning in the journey as well, right? But it's just in a different way. You can go the philosophical route, by examining the natural world or, questions like that. You can go several different ways, right? There's a whole philosophical position of hedonism, right? Which just says, hey, you're here, you might as well do stuff that feels good, and that's all that really matters. And, I don't really espouse that position, but if you look at, again, if you examine nature, how do animals live? That's kind of how animals live, is the prime directive is to reproduce, to get your genes into the next generation. And then everything else essentially is just avoiding suffering, like trying not to die, trying to be as comfortable as possible. You look at the human species, you see, our high rates of obesity and, all of the way we've sort of constructed our environment to be comfortable. You go, there's definitely a high hedonistic element. So I think that some people can make that the meaning of their lives, especially if they have the resources to do so. So yeah, that meaning comes from, it can come from both implicit or explicit philosophies, right? If you never self-reflect, if you never metacognitively consider what the meaning of life is, then I think you're more likely to be guided by things that are either natural to being a physical human, which is hedonism, right? Doing things to feel good, or to being naturally led by things that are imposed upon you by others, your family or your specific cultural society, what religion happens to be prevalent, what things you've been taught. But I think that you can also have an explicit philosophy on the meaning of life if you cognitive reflect and you metacognitively look around and start to think about how things go. So the meaning, is just, again, that putting together of all the pieces. And I think that you can find that in a religious context or in a secular context. You can also not find it at all. And that's a philosophy in itself. It's called absurdism. And Albert Camus specifically was kind of the leader of that. And that was his position, is that life is not worth living. And that's why it's called absurdism, is that life is just absurd. The whole us just being here, like, why? There's no reason for us to be here. There's no reason for us to have consciousness. And basically, he said as much, if we were brave enough, we'd all just kill ourselves because we're just here and we're suffering. That was his position. And I think that if you were in his, if you're living life in his shoes, looking through his eyes, I think that makes sense. But with my position being that meaning is a subjective, personalized thing, I don't think that applies to everybody as a whole, right? Because I think that I can't speak for you, but I know for me, I have a great life that's full of meaning, and so I don't really identify with this idea that, well, why am I here? Like, what's the point? I should just kill myself because everything is suffering. Like, okay, well, I'm 50% there. Like, why am I here? What's the point of consciousness? I can understand those questions. But it's not all suffering. I think that life is full of love and relationships and beautiful things that are worth exploring. And so that's where the divergence in how we make sense of the epistemic and the metaphysical and the ontological experience goes, right? Camus put it together in a different way from how I put it together. And as a result, we have two different meanings of what it means to exist.
One of the things that came forward for me while you were talking is when you were talking about the rejection of a God, like the arrogant rejection of it. It doesn't exist. I know it doesn't exist. I wonder how much of that is actually thinking that you know, or how much it is wanting that to be true. And there's a couple of loose-hanging things to add to that, because it feels to me that everybody, like you said, has an underlying philosophy, but also everybody has a underlying sense of what is meaningful, what is true, what is good, and what is bad. And then you can ask yourself the question what that is based on, and then you're gonna dig a little bit to see what the answer to that question is. But a couple of things that came forward are the idea of, if somebody who rejects God in that position is in the middle of the ocean on a boat all by himself and will very likely, almost certainly die, because boat is sinking, no time, it's 2,000 kilometers to the coast. That person is done for. And that person will very likely, I think almost inevitably, will start praying or wishing, let's say, for something or someone to save him. And then the question you can ask yourself is, what are you praying to? What are you wishing? Who are you aiming your wish towards? Is it the universe? Is it nature? Is it God? Is it people? Who is it going towards? And then you can also ask yourself the question, okay, what is driving that praying anyway? Is it a philosophy under that? How did you establish that?
So I'm working on my doctorate in psychology, and that's where I like being a generalist as a person, right? Because you can draw on multiple different sources of knowledge to gain insight into an answer, right? And so I think that how a psychologist would answer your question versus a philosopher versus a clergyman versus an evolutionary biologist, like I think everybody would answer those questions differently. And so as a generalist, I have a little bit of insight from each one, right? I've done a little bit of studying each one. And so trying to piece together that answer is a little bit different for me from everybody else with a little bit more perspective. But I think that guy who's out on the ocean, I think there's several different things that are going on, right? The evolutionary biologist is going to say, well, the human brain has developed in such a way over the phylogeny of the species that we are more inclined to see danger where there is none and to see meaning where there is none, because that protects our survival, right? So if you're a caveman out on the plains and there's a rustling in the grass, you're better off thinking you see a lion and taking defensive action than hearing the rustling in the grass and going, oh, it's just the wind, and having it actually be a lion that eats you, So an evolutionary biologist says that's in your brain. And so if you're dying, your natural inclination is to try to make more meaning of the situation than there is, right? To try to construct something that's bigger. And that's whatever it is that you're praying to, right? Something that can sort of get you out of this jam. A psychologist, is going to look at it and say, okay, well, whatever you're praying to is whatever is latent in the synaptic structure of your brain. So, however old this guy is, 20, 40, 60 years old, over the course of time, his brain has made various connections based off of the behaviors and the thoughts he's engaged in throughout his life. Whether or not he was religious or is currently religious, whether or not he, what he believes his chances for survival are, how good of a sailor he is. All of those things are going to play in. And then so when he starts praying, it'll probably have that background, right? So if he was raised as a Christian, he's probably not going to start praying to Vishnu, because he just wouldn't have a conception or an idea of what that is, Obviously a clergy person's going to say, that somebody's dying and they're searching for meaning in a deep way, and in that deep search that maybe they've never engaged in to that level before, is going to allow them to actually access God, and they're going to be able to speak directly to him, and they'll be saved in that moment before they die. I think that it's possible that there's some combination of all of these elements, because I think that that's usually the way life works out. I think that probably the psychological answer is the one that's closest to the truth, where whatever we sort of have in our background is what's going to manifest in that moment, and maybe it's, if I was religious when I was a child, but I'm not now, and I start praying to that God, there might be a security element in it, right? Maybe when I was a child, I felt safer, and now here I am about to die. And so I'm trying to return to that place of safety. This is something we see physically manifested, right? When people die, they curl up into the fetal position, because it's a defensive position, right? It's a position where you instinctively, as a human, feel safe in that position, because that's where you were at in the womb, So I think that it's sort of that, but on a cognitive level a bit. If you know you're going to die, you might physically curl up into the fetal position, but you're also going to cognitively curl up into the fetal position as well. You're going to try to find some element of safety. And whether that lies in our ancient evolutionary past or our personal, intellectual past, or an actual religious environment, it's hard to say, but it's, I think that somewhere in there lies the answer to who we'd be praying to or why.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty automatic. I think it happens for a large part unconscious, or at least in the unconscious area. And let me give you a very clear and recent example. So we had a pet who passed away last weekend, from the night from Saturday to Sunday. So we took the entire evening, which was a terrible evening for many reasons, but we took the entire evening to spend time with her. Just to make her as comfortable as possible, give her some food, give her some final tasty snack, something like that. And then after midnight, I believe around 12:15, we laid her back in her home and we said our final goodbyes, and in silence, I was wishing to myself, the coming night, I wish you will go very peacefully, right? Because it was very clear there was suffering going on, and there's no point in that lasting for 3 days or 4 days or maybe even longer. So I hope the coming night will be the night, and during the sleep or something like that, it will happen. And that was good. We went to bed. My wife and I went to bed, and the next morning we checked. And indeed, she was gone. So that wish became fulfilled. And I remember very clearly that I felt a lot of gratitude for that, because that's something that I wished for. I'm not sure if it's wishing or praying. I think it's wishing. But I remember feeling gratitude for that. Like, man, it's good. This is it. You know, that it went peacefully. We managed to make it very symbolic, in the sense of we managed to, with a lot of symbolic value. I mean, we managed to say our goodbyes. We managed to treat her for her last time. You know, we managed to talk with her. We managed to think about her, and then that was the moment that it indeed happened that we wished for, with as little pain as possible. That entire process, from my experience, was pretty automatic, right? Including the wishing for that to be taken in that night. The question that I'm asking myself then is, that wish, what is it based upon? Is that a religious wish? Is that a praying towards a higher deity to hopefully hear my words and to take action based upon that pray? Is it the psychological element that you just mentioned, right? So in this case, I think that would be something along the lines of, based on past experiences with pets and with animals, and also with humans for that matter, I know what suffering is, and I know what it means. I know what pain prolonged suffering can bring. So based on that knowledge and that experience, I wish that not being the case right now, or that there's something else that happens there. And that is not a very conscious process. And I think, and maybe, I'm not sure if it's ever conscious, but I think in this case it happened very automatically. But then my question will be, how do you determine what that is based upon? Is it based upon a philosophy? Is that based upon an underlying belief? Is that belief religious or not? Humans are very interesting in that way, right? Because humans take actions that are symbolic. When somebody close to them dies or is very sick or something like that, we light candles, right? We come together, we eat food together. We have funerals, that are highly symbolic for many reasons. We give. I'm not sure if the word speech is the right word here, but on a funeral, one can give a speech or like a yeah, I don't know
eulogy.
what the word is, but yeah, exactly. That's highly symbolic. And then the question I ask myself is, why do humans do that? Where is that coming from? Is that psychological, religious, or something else? What is that?
Yeah, I think that there's two approaches to the answer. There's the philosophical one, which, philosophers have been asking themselves throughout history. And, philosophy is full of more questions than answers. So it's not something that is really, fully understood. But it's this idea of, we don't know, going back to Camus, right? We don't know why we're conscious in the first place. Like, why do we understand that we're going to die? Why do we understand what death means? Because we don't know for sure, but when we look at animals in nature, we don't think that they have that kind of understanding, right? We don't, they're just alive or they're dead. They don't understand. They don't know what death means. They don't understand that that's the end of them. So why do humans have that understanding? That's a big question in philosophy. It's a big question in psychology, evolutionary psychology, right? Why did our brains develop to have this knowledge? And what purpose does it serve, right? You can argue that it has a self-preservational purpose, right? It helps us to take steps to ensure our survival. But the inevitability of death means that we will necessarily know at some point we're going to fail at that. And then we have to think about what's going to happen after we die. So where is the benefit in that occurring? So that's kind of an unanswered question. On the psychological side, I think what we're experiencing is empathy, right? Which is something that, although is sort of easy for us to understand as humans, animals have it as well. Where empathy sort of stems from is this. We have what's called mirror neurons, right? So if I start playing guitar, or I start, hammering a nail into a board or something, and you're watching me, what they found is that then they'll watch your brain, and in the spot, what's called the motor homunculus, it's responsible for sending signals to your brain. The same neurons that fire for me when I'm hammering fire in your brain when you watch me hammer. So somewhere in your brain, you're performing that activity subconsciously. You're practicing, and that's how we learn from visual information, right? Not a lot of animals can do that. A lot of them have to learn by doing. Humans can look and just observe and learn through that process. But part of that is putting yourself in another person's shoes. And so when we see something that's suffering, we're putting ourselves in their shoes. We understand. We not only have that thing that I was just talking about on the philosophical side, where for some reason we understand our own death and we understand that something, when we die, we're gone. But then also on the psychological side, we have the mirror neurons and the ability to understand what the person or the animal's going through at that time. And we have that empathy to understand that, we wouldn't want that suffering for us, and we don't want it for anything else. And, and so I think that all of that is sort of the impetus, the driving factor for the feeling. And it culminates in this wish that the suffering will stop. And who are we directing the wish or the prayer to? Again, I think that's where it comes back to having a bit of a personal meaning, right? And if you don't have a religious paradigm, then I think it's probably just nature, because when you look around at nature, you see how devastating it can be, how terrible it can be. And so when you just go, man, just make this quick and painless, I think that in some ways it's directed back towards nature, and that gratitude can be felt in a number of ways, right? It can be felt if nature does make that quick and in the sleep. But if it isn't, if it drags out 3 or 4 days, there's also, in some ways, other ways of thinking about it, right? I've got a 17-year-old cat right now. My mother has a 17-year-old dog. And you go, you see him struggling, struggling with the back legs a little bit to get up and not being able to see and not being able to hear. And, like you said, trying to keep him comfortable, trying to keep him, happy. And, you can still have some gratitude in that, where you can say, they've lived this long, good life that they would not have been able to live if they were out in the wild. They've been loved, regardless of how short it is. Even if my cat got cancer when it was 6 months old and died, I can still say that cat experienced some love, right? I was able to show him some affection, And when you think about it, this is another one of those things where we, as humans, we just gloss over the fact that this relationship exists and is very powerful and special, because when you look out in nature, you see all of these things killing each other or competing for resources or doing these sorts of things. And how weird is it that we accept this other species into our house and feed them and take care of them and don't expect anything in return and show them affection, That's really special, I think, and regardless of the length of the life or the suffering that occurs at the end, I think that there's something in that's really important. And obviously anything that goes for pets or for animals goes even more so for human beings. But I don't know if that totally answers your question, but
I think it's ordering the infinite chaos that nature can bring. Because I think you're right? Nature can and very likely is very brutal in almost every single sense. So when people speak about nature in this more idealistic way, they probably have in their mind, this beautiful mountain in the background with this waterfall with all the antelopes jumping from left to right, just like in the Lion King opening scene, right? And that's what people think about when they think about nature. But nature is this, like you said, this place where everything tries to kill everything, right? It's a survival of the fittest kind of situation. It's brutal. And everything that lives in it almost, whether it's plants or animals, or humans for that matter, they will not be able to live their maximum extent in peace and in quiet and in harmony and live happy lives, let's say. That's also, I think, a very good argument to bring to the idea of that sometimes people bring forward the idea of pets are prisoners. And this also came forward in one of your podcasts. And I think that's a very silly way to think about it, right? You're inviting pets into, I think you're inviting pets into your home, like you said. And I think you're giving them, or at least you should give them, a life that is optimal for them so they can live in harmony, in peace, in quiet, have their needs fulfilled, and they have the attention that they want without having a danger of a predator coming around to eat them, right? That is not taking their freedom away. In an ideal sense, it's organizing the infinite chaos that they live in such a way that they can still be a cat, or they can still be a dog, or they can still be a hamster, or whatever it is. They are not inhibited in doing their cat things or dog things, but the danger is being taken away. And on top of that, they have creatures, these big creatures that walk on two legs, taking care of them and feeding them and making sure that all their needs are being taken care of. I think that's an absolute beautiful thing that humans do. I think it's beautiful for multiple reasons. I think it's very symbolic for the very simple reason that humans are clearly able to take care of other creatures that are not them, which is very interesting to see, because I don't think there's many creatures in the wild that do that, that take care of other creatures, let alone their own creatures, because there's a whole lot of let's look at, for example, I think rats are very family oriented, so I think they are, I'm not even sure if they share food, for example, but let's just say that most animals will just take all the food for themselves. I think that's technically true. But yet somehow humans are able to not just take care of themselves and their family and, their own species, but they're able to integrate with other species and create a relationship that is mutually beneficial, where both the pet and the human are being taken care of in some way or another, whether it's physical or psychological or meaningful even. That's highly interesting to me.
Yeah, and it's still a complicated question, right? Because we have to bring in this idea of, when we're talking about pets being prisoners, this idea of what they understand, right? Because we understand the idea that they'll die. And so, but they don't really understand that, right? We don't think they do anyways. We understand them to want is to act the way a cat or a dog does, right? And so if we think about, so for instance, my mom's dog is a border collie, so a dog that's bred for herding sheep. So she likes to go outside. She likes to run in big open spaces. She likes to have something to herd. Nowadays it's grandchildren, but back in the day it could be other animals. So if you were to take that dog as a pet and keep it in like a New York City apartment, like an 8 by 10 foot apartment, and it never got to go out and do anything. And most pets end up spayed or neutered, right? They don't have an ability to reproduce. So an evolutionary biologist would say, well, now they can't spread their genes into the next generation, and that's their number one purpose. So if you take away their ability to reproduce, and you take away the stimuli that they were bred for, that type of thing, and you just provide them a safe area and some bland food and water. And some people, it's really a shame, but some people don't even pay their pets attention, right? They don't even give them affection, right? We have, you hear stories of people leaving their dogs out in the cold all day and, never letting them inside.
Yeah.
So I think there's an element where I think that it could, and there's a huge debate about the ethical impact of zoos. Is it ethical to keep zoo animals? So I think it's a more complicated question, right? I think that what I like going to nature preserves where they have animals that couldn't live in the wild. We have one around here, we have a bald eagle that's missing an eye, and a turkey vulture that was hit in the road, and, a hawk that had its wings clipped, a few other birds like that. And so to give these birds a safe place to live out their lives, right? And to be able to, show them some affection and provide them a means of living and educate and entertain the public as well. I think that's a noble thing, If you're taking or if you have an endangered species, right? A species that is going extinct in the wild, and so you're trying to breed them domestically in order to increase their population to release them. Or if you're a good pet owner, you're actually a pet owner that shows affection and provides the things that the pet needs. I think that those are all noble things. I don't think that there's really much of an ethical question. But there's bad pet owners, right? Or if you have a zoo that doesn't provide the facilities that are required for a species that could just as easily live in the wild, its own life, it might not live as long, right? It might die in the wild at 3 years old, and it might live to be 7 in the zoo. But if it never has the chance to reproduce, it never has the chance to do the behaviors that it's bred to do, then I think that question of, well, if it doesn't know anything about death, then 3 or 7 years doesn't make any difference to it. What makes a difference to it is its ability to function as it was meant to, So I think it's a complicated question. I think that, it's really context dependent on whether pets are prisoners in some regard.
Yeah, and this is also where you touch upon the question, what is good and what is bad? Right?
Yeah.
How do you treat a pet in a good way, and how do you treat them in a bad way? And where's that line exactly? And what behavior falls under one of these two categories? And when you want to break that down, this is, I think, a very famous one. This is often done in philosophical debates. How do you define what is good exactly? And then you try to dig a little bit, and you try to ask this question a couple of times to go just a layer deeper every single time, just to see what the essence is of what someone truly believes, right? What they are deriving the idea of what is good from. Maybe that's a good question for you.
Yeah.
How would you approach that question? Like, how do you define what is good and what is bad?
I'm glad that you asked that, because I was thinking about it when you were making the prior response. But I was thinking about it in much bigger terms, right? Because when you were talking about nature, right, and how nature is this, it's really, I mean, if you were going to describe nature, it's just an overwhelming force, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it brings good things. Sometimes it brings death, but this, I forget how you put it, like the infinite chaos, right, of nature. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Infinite chaos of nature. It's a great term, because that's what it is. And what that immediately brought to my mind was, how religions struggle with what's called the problem of evil, right? And this is a big, question in philosophy of religion, especially, right? Because if you have a religious paradigm, this goes back to what we were saying at the beginning, right? If you're religious, then you have a book or a set of books that provide you all the answers. And so it's sort of easy to be, to feel like But then, yeah, when you start to dig into things, you start getting asked hard questions that maybe the book doesn't answer directly. Now you're trying to fill in those gaps and trying to maintain the logical integrity and the analytical, structure of your beliefs. And the problem of evil, I think, is the most problematic one. And, for most religions, I'll use Christianity as an example just because that's the most common across the world, but especially, in our countries. This idea that, all right, you have God, and he's all knowing, all powerful, all good. But then he creates Lucifer. So why would he do that? Because if he's all-knowing, then he must have known Lucifer would betray him and turn into Satan at some point. And if he knew Lucifer was going to betray him and turn into Satan, he would know that Lucifer would take a third of the angels and, a large swath of humanity with him to hell eventually. And now we have to sort of reconcile that with this idea that God is completely good. And we go, okay, well, so God could have created a perfect world. I mean, he essentially just could have created heaven. There was really no need for earth or hell or any of it. He could have just created a perfect thing if he was all powerful, all knowing, all good. But instead he created this thing that was flawed. I mean, there's really no way around it, and what religious scholars want to say is that, well, he created free will, free choice. And so it's not that he created Lucifer evil, he just gave Lucifer free choice and then Lucifer chose to be evil. But then the question is, well, how does evil exist without being created, right? how did the thought come into Lucifer's mind to do something evil unless the way he was created allowed him to think that way? And so, and it goes on and on and on, right? And you can talk about Lucifer, you can talk about Adam and Eve, whoever, right? However you want to bring sin, right, evil into the picture, it becomes very problematic when you try to trace it back to the root of God as being all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good. And so what's the answer to that? I don't know, right? That's why I believe that everybody's necessarily agnostic, right? Is because to me, I don't see an answer to that question that results in a squaring of God as an omnipotent being with evil being present in the world. I think that there has to be a different answer. But religious scholars, specifically Pope John Paul II, wrote a pretty long treatise on it. So they think about these things. They think about these things a lot, and they come up with answers that attempt to preserve the logic and the integrity of the religions. But, I guess how you interpret them is more indicative of how successful they were, I guess.
I think this is a highly interesting question. The idea of why does evil exist if God is all-knowing and all-good? And this is actually something I've been thinking about lately, something I'm trying to break down. So I'm going to give you a very flawed answer, but let me hear what you think about this.
Okay.
It sounds to me like good by itself cannot exist, because something cannot be good if the opposite is not possible, right? So there needs to be, because if there was no evil, good is just that. It just is, right? It just is. It just exists by itself. And you couldn't classify it as a good because there is no alternative. So there has to be something that is evil. So the question, why does evil exist if God is all-knowing and all-good? The answer might be something along the lines of, in order to know what is good, you first have to understand what evil is. And you can stretch it a little bit further and say something along the lines of, in order to become good, you first have to make sure that you have your evil under control. And this also ties into the idea, the Jungian idea, for example, that every human carries a shadow, right? Every human has the capacity to do evil. And evil can be classified, I think, technically, as that which, in a religious sense at least, that which goes against the, I wanted to say that which goes against the order of the world, but that's a very vague, nonsensical statement. It will probably be more something along the lines of that which harms the divinity. And that also builds upon the idea that all humans are created in the image of God, and therefore they contain a certain divinity. So if you harm that by killing humans, for example, you break that. Yeah, you break that. So that therefore that is an evil act. So the question, why does evil exist if God is all-knowing and all-good? It might be because being good by itself without the capacity for evil means you are naive, you don't know anything, you accept everything that you're being told, and you can't think for yourself, and you're just living a pretty pointless life, I would say. Because it's not aimed at anything, right? You just are, you just exist. And I think that also ties into the whole Adam and Eve story, because that story tells a story about two humans who are not conscious until they eat the forbidden fruit. And that's when they become conscious, and that's when they are being cast out of heaven, let's say. So in order to understand that which is good, you have to understand that which is evil. And a last thing that I learned recently to add to that is what I was curious in is what religious people, so what Christians mean when they say that they have been saved by Jesus, or they've been saved in general. I had no idea what that meant. And I still don't, to be honest. But I do know that one of the components of the answer is that people can only be saved once they are in the depths, right? Because there's no saving someone if they are living happily and they're completely fine. How can you save someone from that? Saving someone implies that they are in danger. It implies that they are in darkness. So in a religious sense, it implies that they are in hell. So that means that in order to reach heaven, in order to reach that which is good, you first have to go through hell. You have to go through the darkness. Which is, I think, exactly the story that is being told, for example, also in the Divine Comedy. Going through the 9 circles of hell in order to reach purgatory, and after purgatory you can reach heaven. So these are all different components. But I think the answer, in short, is that evil was created in order for people to appreciate and understand and live in a good way. And that is the religious answer. So that's just from that specific perspective.
Yeah, and that's a really good portrayal of the religious answer. That's what a lot of the established theologians have sort of given. And it does make sense from that point. I think the problem is that it doesn't go back far enough, right? Because it doesn't alleviate the issue where, because it makes sense, right? Yeah, and you can't have just good, because then humans or angels would just be automatons. If there's no choice or ability to do evil, then are you really alive? Are you really conscious, like you were mentioning? And I think that's a legitimate argument. But it still doesn't get us back to, in the beginning, there was nothing but God, right? So if God is all good, how does evil come about, right? I don't think that God could create evil if he's all good. But if evil exists outside of God, then I don't think that that's possible, because God is omnipotent, right? He's all-knowing, all-powerful, everywhere. He exists outside of time. So where did evil come from? I think that's where, like, my sticking point that I still haven't seen an answer for is, I think that the whole argument from there forward makes sense. And I can understand, I think that the theologians do a great job explaining why evil exists. And it's kind of a bit of an Eastern answer too, because, that's sort of the way that Buddhists conceptualize good and evil as well. You have the yin and the yang and everything. You can't have good without evil. There's this, you need one to know the other. I think that that's very, very instinctive, it makes a lot of sense. But I think that where it separates is that in Western religions, you have this deity that's supposed to be in charge of everything. And if he's not in charge of evil, then he's not in charge of everything. And I mean, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that if it's stated that way in the religious text, right? If you were to say God is all, he's all good and he's out there, but evil also exists, then, the story can proceed forward as the way that it did. But the fact that God created Lucifer, that he created Satan essentially, while being all good, I just don't know if this idea of, he just created free will. But if evil is an extension of free will, then, and God is the creator of it, then in some way, and if he's all knowing and outside of time, he had to see the whole thing play out. At that point, I think, and this is where it becomes a moral question, right? If we put ourselves into God's shoes, wouldn't it be better not to create that than to create it and send millions of people to hell? Why is it good to create people that can go to heaven and go to hell versus not create any people at all? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is,
So there's a couple of things coming forward for me while you were talking. I think the first one is it depends on what your definition of good is. So I think in the current definition, it implies that humans can decide what good is. So why would evil exist? Well, because the good is the flourishing of humanity, for example. Humans being happy, humans being fulfilled, having their needs taken care of, that kind of stuff. But maybe that is not the good. Maybe the challenge of overcoming evil and therefore creating something that is of higher value and more important, and that can only be reached by overcoming evil, is is better, is higher value than what could have been reached if just a framework of goodness existed. Because you can make the argument once again that, and this is a very simple explanation, a very short explanation, but I think that if you put two humans out in the world, one is perfectly good and one has a shadow and has to overcome that shadow in order to become, let's say, their good self, their better self, their optimal self. Then you can ask yourself the question, which one of those is more likely to be more successful in life? And you can infinitely get down in a definition battle with this, because then you can ask yourself the question like, okay, how do you define what is successful? But let's leave that aside for now. I think in this specific sense, you have two humans. One is perfectly good, one has a shadow to get under control. Which one is more likely to become successful? And I think the answer to that question is the one that has the shadow, for the reason that one that is perfectly good will be naive, will not try to offend others, will not try to dominate, will not try to put their own voice forward because it might be in contradiction to other people. And therefore the probability of that person being successful in life, and you could very well, in this case, talk to somebody who's hyper agreeable, for example, is lower than somebody who has that shadow, who has the capacity to say no, who has the capacity to be offensive in an organized way, right? It shouldn't get out of control, because then you get all sorts of issues, but in an organized way, because then you integrate goodness with a shadow to become more competent and to go forward in life in a sense that is more effective to both themselves and to their environment around them. So if you link this to the question, why does evil exist? Maybe it exists as a component of life to get under control, to harness, and to make sure that it is aimed in such a way that it becomes productive instead of destructive. So productive aggression, I'm not sure if this is the right way to think about it, but if we consider aggression to be an evil act, and I'm not sure if this is the right thing to do, but just for the sake of this argument, if we consider aggression to be an evil act, right? You can make the argument like, yeah, that's definitely the case, because somebody who is aggressive and who doesn't have their aggression under control, they will kill someone, right? And that's an evil act. But they can also become assertive, good negotiators, good communicators, good leaders, right? People who are able to put their vision forward and to make sure that people are inspired by that and want to go to battle, for example, with that vision in mind. That is aggression harnessed in a good way. Maybe that's the reason why evil exists. Maybe it's not people are. Maybe evil as a concept is not necessarily something that is destructive or puts someone in hell in a religious sense. Maybe evil is a trait in a psychological sense, or a component in a human sense, or something that can be harnessed, that can be controlled, and that can be used, let's say, in a certain way. So maybe that answers the question of why evil was created, to prevent weak humans from existing.
If we're talking from a religious sense, I'm still seeing problems, right? Mm-hmm. Where I think that it makes sense. So yeah, if you had a perfectly good person dropped into our world, yeah, they wouldn't last. They wouldn't do well. But initially, that's not what it was, right? Initially, God created everything and he said it's good. So it was all good. And then Adam and Eve were deceived by Satan, ate the apple, and then sin entered the world, and then everything was evil. But in prior to that, when everything was good, I think a perfect being probably would have done just as well as it, probably better than an imperfect being, right? You'd hope. But the question was Adam or Eve perfect from the beginning, if they were able to eat the apple, right? If they were able to make that decision to rebel, then essentially they were probably imperfect beings in a perfect world. And in that case, this idea of, it's just, I'm trying to think of a way to put it. It's really how I like if we're talking about evil from like a secular standpoint, I like where we're going because it opens up the question of, does evil exist? And I think going back to your point about assertiveness, that's a good point, right? Humans are, born with and then develop all kinds of emotions. And our cognitive function is built off of our emotions, actually. If you look at the development of the brain, you have all of the emotions, and the emotions guide the way that you cognitively develop. And even us as adults, right? Here we are having a philosophical conversation that's highly abstract and analytical and logical, but underneath, there's still emotions informing how our cognitions are developing, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's important because what that kind of shows us is that emotions are morally neutral to some extent, right? Aggression is not evil because aggression is just an information data point that tells you cognitively how to proceed in a certain environment. Now, from that point, you can cognitively make an evil decision, right? If I was a sociopath, I could use my aggression to say, okay, I'm going to take advantage of these people that didn't do anything to me for personal gain. But aggression could also just as easily inform my decisions as a normal person to intercede against a sociopath who's trying to take advantage of innocent people for personal gain, right? And that would be a good action. So emotions are informative to cognition, but in and of themselves, I don't think that they have a moral weight. So I like that. I like that from the secular side, this question of does good or evil exist, right? Because then we can look out into the world and into the universe and start asking, okay, well, when we look at, let's go, if it's that sociopath, right, who's taking advantage of people, we're inclined to say that's evil. But if we look into nature, right, you mentioned rats before, and I had pet rats when I was a teenager, actually, and they make great pets. But I remember when I got mine as little babies, they had to take the father and separate him away because once the babies were born, the dad would just eat them. And from a human standpoint, that seems evil. But in nature, it's just the way things are, And this is part of what I'm writing about in my book that's going to be coming out in a couple of weeks, is how our human coloring of what it means to exist in reality sometimes leads us to make assumptions about what's right and wrong or good and bad or what it means to even experience or exist. And we're just basing that off of our own position, not really what the totality of the information tells us, right? So I think that talking about good and evil from the secular standpoint is a little bit more interesting because, again, if I go back to that religious viewpoint and start talking about, all of the intricacies of how good and evil exist there, I just can't get away from that initial point of, yeah, but if God is all good and all powerful and all knowing, if I put, if anybody puts themselves into his shoes at that point, I just don't think you create a world where people can end up eternally damned. Like, it just seems like a really rough thing to kind of stomach, Like if I could see the whole thing into the future, and I'm not 100% good, right? I know I'm not all good, right? I have some evil tendencies. I still couldn't see myself ever sending somebody to be eternally punished, So that's the point where I struggle with it, I just can't. I think the only way that you get out of that is through the narrative, and I think that's kind of what you were establishing, right? Is this? There has to be a narrative because, if everything's all good, then there's really no change. It's just a static system where things exist and it's autonomous. There is no free will. There's nothing that changes. And I think as humans, that seems problematic to us, but I think we need to examine the reasons why it seems problematic to us, right? I think the reasons it seems problematic to us is because of our experience of reality. In reality, we see that everything around us is always changing. And we see that we have a life story, right? We go through this arc where we do fight with evil tendencies, and we do, at least we hope that we make good choices and we overcome them. And so our lives, our experience are rooted in stories. And so I think that we sort of extend those stories into our conceptions of how religion works. And so for us to say, well, there couldn't just be an eternity of good because then there'd be no change and everything would just be whatever. That's based off of our human bias, I think, right? Because I think that if you were to ask some people, hey, you don't have any free will, but you experience an eternity of only blissful, good, great things. Everything is perfect. I think people would certainly struggle to answer whether or not they would want that. But I think even that comes back to our human nature and our conception of reality as always being changing and always having this story. And honestly, us always having agency, right? And agency is a complicated thing that I address in my book, right? Because agency is something that we like to think we have a lot more of than we do. We like to think that every choice we make is something that we are consciously arriving at. But the fact of the matter is, the structure of our human brains that's built into our biology, the relationships we have with friends and family, the environmental impacts of what we eat and what we breathe in, the place we live in the world, all of those things influence every decision that we make subconsciously, So there's just this little layer on top, you have this whole huge brain in your head, but really you just have this little prefrontal cortex in the front that does the conscious decision making. And when we say conscious decision making, it's not deciding its own path. It's taking all of the information from all of the stuff in the back of the brain and then giving you the most likely answer. So I think when we integrate some of that knowledge, some of that epistemological background into the religious context, I just can't get past that first step. I just can't get past how evil could exist in that framework.
Okay, there's two things there's a lot of things coming forward, but two things I would like to react to. The first one is when you said emotions don't have moral weight, and the second one is, and let's start with the second one because that goes back to that whole Garden of Eve situation. Maybe the answer to So the problem that you're laying out, and it's a problem that makes sense. The problem that you're laying out is, if God was all-knowing and all-good, why did he create the concept of evil?
And just, sorry to interrupt you, but I think that another sort of caveat to that question would be, could you also create some measure of free will that allowed for choices that were only good, right? So if I'm in heaven, and this is just going to be a stupid conception of heaven, right? But it's not like I'm just a robot moving around with no choice. But hey, if I'm in heaven, could I decide to eat a lollipop or ride a roller coaster? That's will of some type, right? It's not 100% free will to do whatever I want. But can evil be separated out of free will? I think that's an interesting question, right? Because I think that's the root of my issue with it, is that this idea that God didn't create evil, he created free will. That's sort of the essence of the religious argument for how evil entered the world. And so my thought is, well, can't we separate evil out of free will to some extent, right? If God created an environment and beings that didn't have access to evil, but did have access to choice within a perfectly good environment, there could still be free will. It would just be that evil didn't exist, right? Is that something that could be possible?
I think the answer to that question is no, because then it wouldn't be called free will, it would be called limited will.
Right.
Because free will implies that there's an infinite possibility of choices that one can make. And if the set of evil choices being filtered out of that, that means there is a huge chunk of decisions you are not able to make, which would prevent that concept from being free will. So I think the answer to that question is no.
My response to that would be that we already only have limited will, right? And I think that people's struggles to stick to a diet or to like this comes back to kind of what I was saying before. Like, so I'm now drawing on the psychology part of it, right? Where I've studied the brain and looked at things and seen, yeah, we have the part in the front that makes decisions, but it doesn't make free will decisions. It makes limited will decisions based off of the input of everything else back there, right? So everything else, all of the stuff that we've already had gets integrated in, and then a decision gets made, right? And sometimes it's unconscious, or subconscious, I guess I should say, right? Food is a great example where, before the information gets all the way to the front to make a decision, some part in the back says, ooh, sugary food, high calories, good for survival, yum, and puts it in your mouth before you've even thought, oh no, wait, I'm on a diet, So I think, so then the question is, does the concept of free will, is this just an abstraction? Is it something that actually exists in reality? I mean, I can't choose to fly like Superman. That's outside my abilities. And I think that's a different thing, right? Because although that would be a free will choice, it's outside of the realm of possibility. So I think we can, it's not totally clear that we need to separate that, but we can separate that and just put it to the realm of possibility. But I think even within the realm of possibility, we still face limited will choices because of just the way our brain functions, right? It doesn't operate as one coherent unit. We perceive it that way because of our conscious experience, but really there are parts of our brain that move independently of one another and move faster or slower than one another. And as a result, we engage in behaviors, right? We talk all the time about, you drive to work and you don't remember any of the drive, right? All of a sudden you're just pulling into the parking lot. You go, oh, wait a minute. Did I run a red light back there? No, you didn't. Like, your brain saw the green, but you didn't consciously perceive it. Somewhere in the back of your brain, your occipital lobe saw the green, it sent it up here, it identified it, and you made an automatic choice to drive through the light. And your brain said, we don't even need to send that up to the decision-making part because we know it's green. In my mind, that's kind of a limited will choice,
This is interesting. I think I see what you mean. I would still push back there, and I would say it's still free will, completely. And this is also where I think the concept of weighting, so giving something weight, has value, because I think, okay, maybe this is a good way to approach this. Earlier on, we talked about nature, and I think that nature is infinite chaos, and I think that the role of humans is to make order out of infinite chaos, and I think that the purpose of chaos is to create, right, to bring forward new things, but also to destroy, right? Chaos has all possibilities, and the role of humans is to organize it in such a way that it empowers the way it empowers our capacity to bring forward that which whatever it is that we do best for ourselves and everything around us. So maybe in this case, you can make the argument that that same logic can be applied to the human brain. So let's say that, like you said, right? 95%, and I don't know what the percentage is, but let's say 95% of the brain is unconscious, right? So there's a lot of calculation happening that you are not aware of, and you do it all the time. Let's approach that idea as the unconscious part of your brain being nature, being infinite chaos. It has all the possibilities, right? So then you can say, okay, if you are trying to make a deal with yourself that you are going to eat more healthy, and you're seeing those sugary snacks coming forward, and your mind from that 95% section is telling you eat that, and you go for it, it means that the weight that you're giving your decision not to go for it is weaker than the impulse that tells you to go for it. So then you can say within that conscious area of your brain, if you make the decision to do something, whether it is leaving that tasty food, whether it is anything else that is hedonistic, because it will be bad for you in the long term or whatever reason, you would need to make sure that that decision is, you give it enough weight. Because if you're just, you're eating this bag of chips, right? And you're like, oh man, I'm already overweight, but I'm so in the mood for chips. I'm gonna have these potato chips. Today is gonna be the last day. From tomorrow forward, I'm gonna start. Right? Just one more day. I can guarantee you're not giving that decision much weight. So then the unconscious impulse of grabbing that chips the next day is going to be strong. It's going to be there, and there's nothing you can do to stop that from happening. Right? You're gonna procrastinate it one more time. But maybe you can make the argument that the purpose of humanity is to organize chaos, and in this case, the chaos is your own mind. So if you make a decision, you are making a decision to organize a piece of chaos for whatever reason. In this case, becoming more healthy, becoming more lean, something along those lines, living longer, whatever. You have to give that decision weight. You have to put value under it. It needs to have meaning, right? Because if it doesn't have any meaning, that decision, you're not going to stick to it because you don't believe in it. It needs to have vision. It needs to have meaning. There needs to be a reason why you are making that decision. And then you can say, the moment that you make that decision, and in the moment that you laid out what that vision is, in the moment that you not necessarily convinced yourself, but that you not forced yourself, but that you oriented yourself in such a way that you're going to follow that decision, that is 100% a free will decision. And what you have done in that situation, I think, is you disallow the chaos of nature, which in this case is also your mind, to put you on the wrong path.
Yeah. I think that it's a pretty good argument. It ultimately plays out, I think, the way that you're saying, but not in the details a little bit, right? So the way that I'll explain that is, so psychologically, what we find out is that people who, if you have somebody who wants to diet, but has no success, and somebody who does want to diet and does have success, intuitively, we as humans think that the one who has success has willpower, right?
Right.
And so there's that word will, free will, the ability to accomplish that task. But what they find is that it's actually not true. If you provide the same temptation to both people, they both give in. So why is the one person successful and the other one's not? What it comes back to, they found, is its external aids. So the person who is more successful tends to be the person who might have a spouse that says, hey, we're not putting chips on the shopping list, so there won't be any in the house for you to eat. Or the person who has a diet journal in their phone and they have to enter every single thing that they eat. And so these external aids, the things that are outside of themselves, are actually what helps them attain their goal. And at that point, now it's sort of a sticky question, right? Did they make a free will decision to be held accountable by outside parties? Or have they acknowledged their limited will and now are using external tools as methods to keep them on track? It's a little tricky. I think that you can make the argument that it's free will, right? That you made a decision to reach for outside help. And as a matter of fact, I think that sort of encapsulates a lot of our human experience, right? I think that this goes back to what you were saying. This is why I said it works in totality, right? Because your idea of humans as creating order out of an infinite chaos, that's what's happening here, right? Is you're recognizing the infinite chaos of your own brain, right? You're recognizing your inability to even harness your own will, and you're creating order outside yourself with tools, technologies, relationships outside of yourself in order to order the chaos of your own mind, right? And I think that that is something that humans tend to excel at. And so is, like you were saying, we always think of ourselves as doing it outside of the world, right? Creating order through new technologies, through new innovations, through these sorts of things, and making order. And we want to think it all comes from our free will. But in some regard, the most successful people, and I think that the most cognitively awakened people, are the people that recognize that they really don't have free will. They have a limited will. And that the acknowledgement of that and the recognition of the limitations allows them to put things that are external to themselves in place in order to accomplish their goals. So that would be kind of my rebuttal, if that makes sense.
Do you consider your consciousness to be internal or external? And what I mean by that is that if you make a choice that is wrong, so let's go to those potato chips again, right? You know that those are bad for you, and you know that you made a deal with yourself not to touch them anymore, but you're still doing it. There should be, I think, a voice going off in your head that tells you you should not be doing this. Do you consider that internal, or do you consider that within the context of what you just said, an external impulse? Because I want to know, the reason why I'm asking that is because you said that free will, that it has been found that in order to foster willpower, there needs to be external stimuli that motivates you, or that puts you on the path of keeping your word and of taking the right action. So the reason why I'm asking this is, can that external stimuli also be the voice in your mind?
Yeah. And so I love this podcast. You've asked so many good questions. It's a lot of fun. But yeah. And so I think that the answer is that we like to separate these things out, but they're really highly relational, right? And so consciousness, right? Does it arise from inside of my head? Well, I think that sort of the obvious answer and the scientific answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
You'd really have to postulate something crazy to say that consciousness doesn't arise from inside your brain, right? But just because that's where it arises doesn't take into account the input of it, right? For instance, I'm a musician, right? So I've got speakers here in my studio. So does the output from my speakers, does the audio come from my speakers? Yes. But there's an input to the speakers. I plug my guitar in, and then that signal from the guitar goes to the speakers to create the sound. It's the same thing with the brain, right? Consciousness arises from within my brain. But really, if there's no external world, if there's no relationships, if there's no technology, if there's no conception of the outside, there's no input for the consciousness to have data to make decisions. And so it's highly relational. And I think that that's where some of this comes into effect if we're talking about eating the junk food, or driving through the stoplight without looking at the color of it. The reason those things become automatic is because they've been done so often that the synaptic connections are so strong that they no longer route through that central executive part of the brain that needs to make a decision. Your brain just says, we make this decision so often that we already know what the answer is, so we don't need to go up to the top to get the answer, right?
It's like a predictive mechanism.
Yeah, so we're going to eat chips because this is what we always do in this situation. And so you can't really, I'm not going to say you can't, but it's highly unlikely that you can make a free will decision to just stop cold turkey. That's going to be much less successful of a strategy than to try to leverage the outside world to give you data that triggers your central executive to make a decision, right? So to have the spouse that says, we're not going to put them in the house. So when you go to the cupboard and you open the door, there's no chips, and you go, oh yeah, I'm not supposed to be eating them. Or you go to eat chips and you've created a new habit of entering your food diary in your phone, and you open it up and you go, oh yeah, I can't eat chips. Like, I can't enter this in my food diary. Like, I have some outside responsibility. So it's this dialectical, reciprocal relationship between the inside and the outside that gives a rise to gives us, that arises from consciousness and free will. It's not something that's totally in isolation. It's not something that's totally inside our control. I think it's it's an interplay of the inside and the outside.
Yeah, I'm super interested in this. I spoke to a adjunct professor who focuses on narcissism a couple of days ago for this podcast. An episode is not out at the moment that you and I were speaking, but the moment that this episode has been published, that episode will also have been published. I asked him a question in that conversation, and that is a question that, in essence, is: does a narcissist know they are a narcissist? And the question that I also asked is: does a narcissist make the conscious decision to become a narcissist? But there's a bit of context under why I asked that question, and the context is that I think, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think that we all have consciousness. If you don't have a consciousness, I think that means you're a psychopath. So generally, I think most healthy humans, let's say, have a consciousness. That means that people have a voice in their mind, ideally, if they listen to it at least, that tells them that they are making the right or the wrong decisions. So, the reason why I asked, does a narcissist allow themselves to become a narcissist, is if the answer to that question is yes, I think that implies that they have ignored that voice. They think they know better. They are not in line with what that voice is telling them. And now that I'm saying this out loud, I'm realizing that I'm making an assumption that that voice always tells people to do the good thing, which I don't think is true. So that's something I instantly have to correct now I'm saying it out loud. But the reason why I'm bringing this forward is because I think that if people are grounded, healthy, can think in a good way, can rationalize in a good way, I think they can listen to themselves. They can listen to you can pretty much, this is a very funny thing to do. And I've learned this in the last couple of years. You can literally, if you are really honest with yourself, you can ask yourself questions. You can bring an honest question forward in your mind. And I found that almost instantly you get an answer. That is not an answer. And this is something that in my personal experience, I really have to question if what is coming forward is something that I've conjured up or projected myself, or that is actually a answer that is coming from subconscious or from another place. But that voice, I found, generally is aimed at goodness. So that means that if I am making a decision, and everybody, I think, makes those decisions, also me, that I know that are not good, that voice will instantly tell me what you're about to do is not good, right? It's the voice that tells you to feel guilty when you've done something, when you said something out of pure emotion to someone else that you didn't want to say, but you were just upset, so you blurted it out, right? That voice will tell you, go apologize. What you did is not good. What I'm wondering is, what is that voice exactly? Because you mentioned earlier in our conversation that emotions don't carry moral weight. I want to push back there, because I think that voice is related to emotions, to our experience, potentially, maybe not, but I think so. And whenever we are making wrong, bad decisions, don't have to be evil, but they can just be bad decisions, right? That voice will tell you to feel guilty or to apologize or to do something about it in order to set things right.
Yeah.
And then the question is, if that is true, and if you agree with that, why is that voice there? And what is that voice? Why does a child who is very young feel guilty when doing something wrong? If there's no, and I'm not sure if the statement is correct, but if there's not enough life experience, why does somebody feel guilty when doing something wrong?
Yeah, I like this. This is a great question. And I'm really interested to hear what how your guest answered it, right? Because I've done some studying in this area, so I think I've got a pretty good answer for it, and I'd be interested to hear what they said. So when the episode comes out, I'm going to listen to it. But so yeah, in the human brain, well, first I'll go back to something you said before. So with the sociopaths, right? They've done studies, and what they've found is that there's a couple different kinds of aggression, right? A normal person can sort of, catch an aggressive tendency in their consciousness and sort of stop from engaging in it. There's a reactive aggression that some people struggle with, which is where basically what happens is they perceive neutral actions of others as being antagonistic, aggressive. So a good example is, let's say I'm playing a video game, right? And you accidentally step in front of the screen and I lose. A normal person would understand that was an accident and go, ah, man, it's frustrating, but it was an accident. Okay. Somebody with reactive aggression will interpret you walking in front of the TV as you intentionally doing it to make me lose and get upset, and become aggressive. Right. So they have this tendency to perceive neutral stimuli in the environment as being targeted towards them. Now, narcissists, and narcissist isn't quite the right word here. We'll stick with like a psychopath, sociopath. The interesting thing about them is that, so with reactive aggressive people, like the one I just mentioned, they'll actually demonstrate cognitive deficiencies in certain brain regions that lead to that behavior. Sociopaths have a well-developed understanding of what they're doing, but they don't have the conscience that's telling them that it's wrong. So if you ask them, and they've done this where they'll show them a video of a bullying episode, or they'll ask them questions about different bullying scenarios, and they'll say, what would you do? Or they'll just watch them engage in a bullying episode, and then they'll ask them after the fact. And the people say, oh yeah, I know it's wrong, but I wanted the lunch money. And so there's no conscience there that's telling them to feel bad about it. They're intellectually, they understand that it's wrong, but emotionally, there's nothing that's saying you should feel bad. And so in the human brain, where these decisions are made is in two areas. So it's two separate areas. There's one for yourself and one for others. It's your ventromedial prefrontal cortex and your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And so the communication between the two, right, and how they integrate with other parts of your brain, this is where brain science is very interesting, right? It's because we understand all of these different areas and how they work, but each person develops differently. And so the connections that they make over the course of their development is all different. So all of us have a dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and a ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And one tells us about our own actions, right? What's good or bad for us. And another one tells us what's good or bad for other people. And then those two communicate to try to come to some agreement on what is a good or bad action when you and I are interacting, right? And how those two communicate and how they come to a decision about what's fair and what's not, and what's good and what's bad, it'll be different between each person. Now, the interesting thing, going back to what you were saying about your own thought process, is that you can, the more you reflect on these things, right, the more those synaptic connections in the front of the brain where you make decisions gets incorporated. And so when you have more interactions with other people, instead of it being automatic, right, that subconscious part where you go, oh, okay, just a snap decision. Well, what they did was wrong and what I'm doing is right. Or, oh, what I did is wrong and I need to feel bad about it. If you're somebody who thinks about it a lot, now it gets kicked up to the next level. Instead of automatically going, oh, I feel bad. Now you're going, well, why do I feel bad? And you're walking yourself through the process. Or, hey, they wronged me. Well, instead of just stopping there and then reacting, they're going, they wronged me. And then you're going, well, why? What did they do exactly? And is there any room for interpretation? Could it have been a mistake? Could it have been something different? So that's the interesting part of it to me, is that the part that makes good decisions about what's right and wrong for you and right and wrong for others are two separate parts of the brain that have to communicate together. And I think that integration is kind of where your conscience comes into play.
But then the question still stands. If you have to, and that's very interesting, by the way, I didn't know that you have two different sections, that one looks introspective and another one looks at other people to together balance out what the right actions are. But with that in mind, the question still stands. Why is your conscience generally, I think, aimed at goodness? Right? Why do you feel guilty after doing something wrong? And I think that even goes for very little children that don't have that foundation. That because this implies, I think, that there is some kind of baked in programming in humans to be good. So, and now that I'm saying this out loud, this could also be an answer to the question, which is a very stereotypical question, but it comes forward quite often, is, do you believe that humans are inherently good or evil? Right? That is a question that often comes forward. And I think with this context in mind, I think the answer is good, because you have a conscience that tells you to do good. And if you decide to disconnect from your conscience, not listen to it, or you don't have to begin with, yeah, then you can go off the rails. But generally, as a default state, I think there's conscience in every human that tells them to do the good thing, or makes them feel guilty and all these other things when they do something that's wrong, across all ages. And then my question is, where does that come from? Because it implies either biological programming, it implies either something divine that makes people act that way. It implies something, but what is that something? Where is it? Why that aim at goodness?
Yeah. I've studied morality, and I've studied early childhood development, and so there's some interesting things that pop up. One is that there's some pre-programming, right? Because the human brain is a relational brain. It's kind of like I was mentioning earlier, right? We really don't have any concept of self without others. We have to have some input for us to understand where we are at in reality, especially as it relates to other people. Mm-hmm. So some of that is, baked into the brain, but really there's a developmental aspect as well, right? All children about the age of 2.5 or 3 learn to lie. And initially, they don't feel bad about it.
Yeah.
Initially, they have to be told that it's wrong. They have to be caught and told that it's wrong. And so our conscience, I think, develops over the course of these interactions where, we get caught lying, we're told it's wrong. We get caught taking something that's not ours, we're told it's wrong, right? So we build up these experiences and we sort of develop this ethical, moral framework over time. And so as adults, we have so much background that it becomes very obvious what's right and wrong based off of our life experiences. But when you're younger, it's really not so much the case. And now it does happen quickly, between the ages of about 2.5 and 4. It's a little bit of a gray area, but usually by the age of 4 or 5, kids have a pretty good idea what's right and wrong, But, if you look at fringe cases, right, people who are abused or neglected as children, or people who don't have that guiding framework, a lot of them grow up to be sociopaths because there never was the input telling them that stealing or being aggressive or lying is wrong. And that's where you get into some of these perpetuated behaviors, right, where if somebody was abused as a child, in many cases they grow up to become abusive because that was the input that they had,
Yeah.
And there's a lot of cases where they break out of it, and so it all depends on how those things are balanced. And, again, it comes back to the individual brain, so there's will, but I'm still sticking with the point that it's limited will, right? You still have some things that are baked in, and then you have early experiences and environmental experiences that you have no control over. And then you do have a part in your brain that allows you to make a decision based off of the information that you have. So I think that's kind of the answer of where some of that comes from.
Yeah, I think I understand the point that you're trying to make. I just don't see how that will be considered limited will, because if you just break it down and make it very practical, you can go outside and do whatever it is that you want, right? You can get arrested for it, obviously, if it's something that's that's illegal, but nothing per se is stopping you to do anything at all, whatever that might be. At least from a decision perspective. If it will succeed is another story, but from a decisions perspective, anything you can do anything that you want. And that whole thing about not being able to stick to the decisions that you make, I think that boils down to what you said in relation to willpower. And I think that's where weighing, where giving the choice that you make enough weight in order to stick to that, that makes that choice possible. And you can also train that, right? Because if you are the kind of person, I believe this is true actually. I think it came forward in a recent Andrew Huberman podcast that and actually I know this was the episode, I think with David Goggins, where they talked about the concept of willpower, right? Where does willpower come from? Why do some people have willpower and why do some people not have willpower? And I don't know what part of the brain, what that part of the brain is called, but it's right here at the front in the center, that if you are the kind of person that trains themselves to stick to a schedule and do the things they say that they do. So if you want to work out 5 times a week, right, or you want to run every morning for an hour or for 2 hours, just like David Goggins is doing, right, and you keep to that schedule, you pretty much grow, especially I think if you don't want to do it. So if you do something, yeah, this was it. If you do something that you don't want to do, right, that you really don't want to do, that's how you grow willpower. And that's how you literally physically grow that part of your brain. If you like running, if you enjoy running and you do it every single day, you're not going to grow that part of your brain because you like it, right? It's not something that you don't want to do. But anyway, by orienting yourself in such a way that you know this to be true and that you know that you can make decisions and that you know how to adhere to those decisions, you can train your willpower, and that's a decision. That's your free will that allows that process to happen. Whether you stick to it or not, I don't think is a problem of willpower. Is a problem of free will, because you have the free will to start with something, but you also have the free will to stop with something prematurely. It's all free will, I think. And maybe another comment there is, and tell me what you think about this, because I don't think we touched upon this yet, but I think there is a belief out there that everything is predetermined. So every action that we take, everything is predetermined, right? So there is no purpose for free will, right? Because everything that you and I are going to do for the rest of our lives has already been written in a book somewhere. It's already known, right? So there's no point for you and I to even think about it, because it's just going to play out the way it's supposed to play out. And I don't think that's true. And then if you ask the question, why don't you think that? Yeah, I will say it's a very good question. Yeah, I think this is one of those questions that doesn't have a proper answer, because the answer I would give to that is, you can look outside, you can look at the interactions of the world, you can look at the birds flying outside and the grandma in the shop saying good morning to you, and you can, based on those things that happen, you can decide on what to do with it. And a deterministic person would say, yeah, but all of those actions will be predetermined. How do you prove that's not predetermined? It's actually a good question. I have no idea what the answer to that is.
Yeah, it's one of the most difficult questions in philosophy is free will versus determinism. And yeah, up until very recently, the scientific answer was determinism, right? It was basically that psychology is applied biology, and biology is applied chemistry, and chemistry is applied physics. So essentially the whole world is physics, right? If we knew the initial state of the universe, then we could predict every single thing that's going to happen. They found out recently that that's not true because of quantum uncertainty. So here comes into effect the infinite chaos of nature, as you put it. It's a great term, because that's what happens. So even if you did know the initial states of all the particles and things, due to, a variety of different quantum laws, the uncertainty paradox and all these other things, entanglement, all kinds of stuff, there's constantly particles popping in and out of existence from different fields that disrupt those things from the beginning. And so it's sort of an amalgamation of the picture, right? Yes, knowing the initial states of the universe gives you an idea of what the large scale structure is, right? We can look at the cosmic microwave background and see where galactic superstructures are and things. But when you get down to the fine details of, neurons firing in my brain, there's too much uncertainty to have ever been able to predict how that will play out. So I don't think that the world is completely deterministic for that reason, right? There's a high level sort of fuzzy determinism, but at the lower level, there is the ability to make choices and have some sort of will. And that position is known as compatibilism. So I'm a compatibilist, right? I think that there's room for both this idea of some aspect of determinism and some aspect of will. Going back to what you and I have been struggling with, this idea of, well, are our actions free will or limited will? I think that it's just, it's again, the input. There's so much background, that we don't have access to, that causes us to go in one way or another. So your description of how willpower is cultivated is correct, right? They've done studies on that, and you laid it out quite well, right? If you actively choose to do things that you don't want to do, that helps you cultivate willpower. But that first step of actively choosing to do something that you don't want to do, it's very difficult to do that without some external help. It's not impossible. I'm not saying it's not possible, but it's very difficult. So most people cannot do it, right? So at that point, we have to ask, well, what percentage would have to be able to do it in order for us to consider it a free will choice? If 50% can just make a choice to do something they don't want to do and do it, and 50% make the choice but then can't follow through on it, was it free will? Or was it limited will? Or if 100% of them make the choice and 10% of them do it with no aids, but 90%, hire a personal trainer and hire a personal chef and develop a routine and do this stuff that keeps them on track. Was it free will in one case or limited will in another case? And this is where we get back to sort of my main point about, we like to think that all of our decisions originate inside of our heads. But the problem is the inside of our heads exists in the wider world, right? We are nature, right? We're a natural being. And so
we parse nature.
Yeah. And so our decisions are predicated on nature, on our context, on our relationships, on our past experiences. And so we certainly have the ability to make choices. And I think that how we define free will determines whether or not we have it, is the way I'd put it, I guess, right? Because certainly we can make any choice, and some of them are outside the realm of possibility. Like, I could decide that I want to speak French for the rest of the episode, but I don't know French, so I would be in a bad boat, right?
Yeah, I appreciate it if you don't.
Yeah, I won't. But so some of those decisions are outside of reality, or, outside of capabilities. Some of them are inside of capabilities. But then the ability to follow through on them, right? Anybody can make a decision, but then the follow through isn't a decision. It's a process, And so I think that's another aspect to it. Like, free will, it's not just a single decision point. It's this process. And, if you're on a diet, right, for 100 days, maybe on 3 of those days you do eat potato chips.
Yeah.
And maybe you had a faltering in free will. Does that mean that you don't have it? Or does that mean that you have limited will? And on those 3 days, due to maybe your nutritional deficiencies or, the stress that you were feeling or whatever, the part of your brain that chooses to eat chips overwhelmed the part that made the free will decision to go on a diet. It's hard to sort of take the whole picture, the whole context, and all of the variables together, and then give weight to which ones determine whether a choice is free will and which one's a limited will, you know? So I don't know if we'll ever get to the bottom of that, you know, on this episode, but it's just something for listeners to think about, you know, on their own. Like, how would you define free will versus limited will? And then apply that back to our discussions about religion and, you know, the problem of evil and all of that. That's what I like to do on my show, right? Is just I try not to give listeners answers so much as things for them to think about on their own and kind of come up with some of their own thoughts. But
yeah, so I think that if we summarize everything that we've discussed so far regarding free will, let me know what you think about this. It sounds to me like free will is the possibility within that infinite chaos to go any direction that you want. So if you, it doesn't determine what you do, but it determines the fact that you have options to choose from. So both sticking to that diet and not eating those potato chips and eating those potato chips when you have decided to be on a diet, both of those fall under the umbrella of free will. I think, so free will is, I think, nothing more than opportunity, right? Possibility, and the opportunity to go any direction. I think which direction you go to, I don't think you're talking about free will then anymore. I think that's when things like discipline come forward and things like willpower come forward. So I think that those are two different axes that work together to determine where you are, where you're gonna go. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think that I think what we've gotten to is like whenever you're constructing an argument, whether it's philosophically or scientifically, whatever, there's a certain number of like preconditions that you have to establish in order for an argument to take. And so if two parties don't agree on the preconditions, then they'll probably never agree on the description of it, you know? And so, and that's probably the majority of where you and I are like discussing back and forth about, is because our preconditions are probably a little bit different, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So with me being a compatibilist, I'm saying, well, there's certain things that are determined, right? Like it's determined that I have 3 pounds of meat instead of 6 pounds of meat. And it's determined that a company made potato chips and they're, you know, I can purchase them. And so within that determinism, there's free will choices. Like I can freely choose I can freely make a choice to do any number of things, but some of them are outside of the realm of possibility. And those ones that are within the realm of possibility, I can freely choose to do them, but there might be constraining factors that determine its success or determine how the process of it plays out. And I think that interaction, so with a free will, between a free will decision and the accomplishment of a goal is where limited will intercedes, I guess, right? I can decide to do anything I want in a moment, but the difference between when I decide to do something and when I accomplish it, that's where certain things that are inside my control and certain things that are outside of my control interact to determine how the path and the process forward ends up turning out.
I love this conversation.
But yeah. But, you know, like us having the podcast, right? We didn't do it last week because, you know, your pet died, you know? And so we had made a decision to have a podcast, but then something that was outside of your control popped up. And so we changed the date. So could you have made a decision to go forward? Yeah, you could have, but you determined that wasn't in the best interest. So we decided to reschedule for today. So in that regard, was it an exercise of free will to reschedule, or was it an exercise of limited will, since originally the original intent had been to podcast last week, but then an intervening circumstance sort of adjusted the plan, right? It's kind of a little vignette, right? There's no good or bad, you know, there's no moral judgment in the decision, but it's just a decision was made, but before it could be carried out, something popped up that interfered with it being carried out the way that it was originally expected. You asked me to upload, a new headshot, right? And I had every intention to do it, right? Make it a free will decision to do it. And then between the 4th of July holiday and everything else that pops up, I still haven't gotten it to you, right? So like, I had a limited will because of things that popped up that interfered with my time. So yeah, just these thoughts about what are the limitations of free choice, right? We can abstractly come up with choices, but then what takes place between a choice and the accomplishment of the action, I think isn't completely in our control, and I think that's when it becomes limited in some way.
Let me tell you a little story, and let's end with that because I'm really curious what you think about this. And this kind of, I think, is a story that goes against free will, and that's totally fine. But let me know what you think about this, because you said that we had originally scheduled to record this podcast last week, and that's correct. And I sent you a message like, "Hey Joel, can we postpone for a week because our pet died last night." So I made that decision to propose that and to do it a week later. I think that was free will. Okay, now the story comes. A couple of days later, on Tuesday, that evening, I had the podcast recording with that professor who focuses on narcissism. And the passing of our pet has not been a very good time. It has been quite, it has been putting a little dim on our moods, let's say. So last Tuesday, I was in this room, right, that you're seeing right now, and I was preparing around 4 o'clock in the afternoon because the recording was 6 o'clock. I was just going over my notes. I was going over my research brief for the last time, going over the pre-prepared questions just to see if everything was in order, just so I'm sharp for the episode. And that whole time I was here, I had the full, I was going over those notes, and that feeling came forward, right? That idea came forward, like, man, I'm so not ready for this conversation. I need to, I'm going to cancel it. I'm going to cancel it. I'm not going to do it. And it was around, I think, 5 o'clock, 5:15 maybe. So around a little bit over an hour after I started in this room. And I was on the verge of canceling that conversation, sending an email like, "Hey, dude, sorry, I can't do it. Something came up, whatever. Just lay out what had happened." That was the intention. That was going to happen, right? My free will told me that was the way forward. For the same reason as I gave you, right? If I'm preoccupied, there's no way I can give you the time and attention that you deserve. There's no way this can be a good conversation, right? You need focus. Else this whole conversation is useless, right? Because you're not going to listen. You're not going to engage. That whole magic, let's say, doesn't happen. On my left side, there's a large window. So I'm looking outside right now, and I heard a sound. I heard a tick on the window, right? Like a small stone going against the window. And I looked to the left, and I saw a little magpie, right? And the magpie was facing left, and he didn't fly into the window. He kicked at it, or he jumped at it, or something along those lines, right? Because I'm sure he didn't fly into the window. It's also not that kind of sound. So I looked at him, and the magpie was facing left, and he was taking a couple of seconds, and he was looking at me as well. And it's like 1.5 meter away from me. So in feet, that's like, I think 4 or 5 feet, something like that. And he took a couple of seconds. And then that magpie made a couple of very playful jumps. And I was still looking at him. Or her. And then that magpie raised his or her left leg and started scratching behind the ear, right? Behind the left ear. In the exact same way that that pet who died a couple of days before did. I've never seen a magpie do that before in that way, especially not looking at me like that. So I saw, and after that scratch happened, a couple of seconds went by, and that magpie flew away, upwards. And a thought came into my mind. And that thought was that that pet that passed away told me it was okay. Everything was good now. That took a little bit. But then I made the decision, I'm going to go ahead with that conversation. So that conversation with the professor about narcissism, that's the conversation that happened less than an hour after that thing happened. So now I'm asking you the question. When you hear this, what do you think that is? Is that free will? Is that divine intervention? Is that just a human seeing patterns because a human is looking for patterns to hold on to in a moment that is sad, right? It can be anything. There's multiple ways to approach this. But what do you think? What do you think that was?
Yeah.
Last question, by the way, sorry for interrupting. The last question, the big question is the choice to move forward then, when it wasn't the choice earlier. Was that free will or was it something else?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it comes back to what we were talking about very early in the episode when we were talking about the meaning of life, right? And how in some ways it's individual, right? And how our guy on the sinking ship, and how we could look at it from a variety of different perspectives and get a variety of different answers. And how we were talking about how the atheistic position isn't a good one because you're claiming to have knowledge about something that it's impossible to have knowledge about, right? All of that plays into your little vignette that you just had, right? Where, you know, if you looked out the window and this bird that, you know, had never stopped there before performed this really peculiar behavior and mimicked your pet in a certain way and flew off, and you had this feeling, is it possible, right, that somewhere up there, you know, there is an afterlife where a pet is able to communicate back to people and provide a sense of meaning and comfort? I don't see why it's not possible, right? There's nothing, I have no way of disproving that, right? And honestly, I wish that that's the truth. I hope that that's the truth, right? Because that's the most uplifting scenario. You know, we could say that, we could say the whole thing is a giant coincidence, right? That maybe that's a normal magpie behavior. You just never saw it before. Or maybe this magpie had a certain type of mite, you know, mite infestation that he was itching at. Or you could come up with any number of reasons for why something might have happened the way that it did. And any of them could be equally explanatory. But I think that the takeaway is that as humans, this comes back to sort of the theme of the episode, right? As humans, we have so little insight into what the answers might be, right? All we have is the little tidbits that we have some insight into. And then we, as individual people, right, with our own brains that have developed in a specific way, have to make meaning out of it. And what's true and what's not true and becomes a question that is almost impossible to answer, right? And so how are we, you know, how do you hold somebody accountable for it? You know, if somebody comes up and says, oh, well, that's a normal magpie behavior when they have a mite infestation. Okay, well, you have some scientific evidence behind that. But you know, if somebody else comes, you know, if it's equally as likely somebody comes along and says, no, they don't really do that. And they also don't kick stones at windows or anything like that. You know, it's our interpretation of it, right? It's what we were talking about earlier when we were talking about narrative and how as humans, we enjoy and we need to create stories for things. We have to have these narrative arcs. Things aren't stable, right? We don't, we don't just exist. Our sense of self is not even a steady state thing. It develops over time. We're always becoming somebody new. The ship of Theseus is always a famous philosophical thought experiment where if you have a ship and you replace it one board at a time until none of the original boards exist, is it the same ship? And you apply that to humans, and every 7 years, all of our cells get replaced. And are we the same person, right? And we talk about psychological continuity and how we're constantly changing. So how do we ever define what we are? That all of those stories, all of those pieces of information play in, but they all play into an overarching reality that we know much less than we think we know, and it opens the possibility for different explanations for similar phenomenon in some way. So what happened there? The simple answer, right, and the one that I give people, and the reason that people get real frustrated talking with philosophers is, I don't know, And that comes back to what I was saying at the beginning, is I love not knowing. I love talking about questions that don't have answers. I love talking about questions, not answers, right? Because it leads to fulfilling conversations like this where we start to think about things deeper and we start to explore possibilities that might not have occurred to us before. So that's kind of the wider answer. As far as the free will one goes, I think that it depends on where we decide the free will occurred, right? So if you made a free will choice to have this podcast last week, but here we are having it this week, then we could say, well, there's no free will. Or we could say, well, you made a free will decision to have this podcast last week, but then something popped up, and then you made a second free will decision to change the podcast to this week. Those are both equally plausible explanations, right? So, but it just determines on if that thing that intervened that was outside of your control, if we factor that into the decision that was made. Because if we factor the thing that was outside of your control into your decision, then I would argue it's a limited will decision. But you could make the argument that a second free will decision was made off of, another thing that was made. So I don't know if that answers all the questions that you had, but that's kind of my response.
Like I said before, I absolutely love this conversation. It was really fun talking with you, and you've definitely given me a whole lot to think about. I know that you have your own podcast called From Nowhere to Nothing, which I can highly recommend. I've listened to a couple of your episodes. It's super, super fun. Specifically the one on pets I've listened to. And I also started with the one about hatred, what hatred is and why it comes forward. And keep doing what you're doing. It's really good stuff. To wrap it up, is there anything that you would like to bring forward, to mention, also about your upcoming book? Let me know where people can find it and what the title of it is, and also make sure to put it in the description. But is there anything left that was unsaid that you would like to bring forward?
No, there's always things that are left unsaid that are fertile ground for future conversations. But it's been so much fun. This is definitely one of my favorite episodes I've ever been a guest on. It's been great to delve into some deep stuff rather than just talking about philosophy, to actually kind of to do it, right? To kind of explore some of these things on the show. So it's been a great time. If anybody wants to check out my podcast, From Nowhere to Nothing, we usually look at just one word or two words, right? And we talk about the what philosophers historically have said about it. We discuss it amongst ourselves, and then we ask questions about what it means for humanity in the future. That can be found anywhere you listen to podcasts. I'll have a book coming out in a couple weeks that addresses a lot of the stuff that we talked about here, which is, the name of it will be A Treatise on Challenges from Nature to Anthropocentric Ontology. And that'll be on Amazon, available across the world. So just a short little book, less than 50 pages, just a quick letter that does what we did here, right? Doesn't offer a bunch of answers, but it will raise a bunch of questions that makes you think a little bit differently about what it means to exist in the world and in nature.
Wonderful. Like you said, more than enough to keep for the future.
Yeah,
Definitely. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.